Hi, I'm Laura Brody, and I'm here to talk to you about visible mending and the technique of Sashiko stitching and Boro. Our workshops here at Remainder's Creative Reuse spotlight on an invaluable but underrepresented contribution of women and BIPOC artists from the last 2 centuries. We highlight the artists' work with examples, talk about their lives, and give a hands-on studio class directly inspired by their work, showing how female and BIPOC artists have strong voices that continue to be integral to the institution of art. So, maybe you've heard about Boro and Sashiko. It's kind of become a little more popular nowadays. But this is not necessarily how it started. I actually got some research on this from a mother and son, Japanese mother and son, who talk about Boro and Sashiko in their blog, Upcycle Stitches. They talk about the history of it, the practice, and how it's come to become something a little bit different in current days. Just like sushi began as something that was really straightforward in Japan and then became rocket rolls and rainbow rolls and everything else. Sashiko is doing the same thing. So Sashiko is a form of stitching, a process of needlework, and that is usually what we would call a running stitch. Pretty straightforward. It means little stabs. You stab in and out. In order to get Boro, Boro used to mean the repaired garment or the garment that needed repair. It was the dirty or worn or falling apart piece that you would use Sashiko on to mend it. This is something that happened during the Edo period in Japan, so from 1600s to the late 1800s. And it was just a part of regular, every daily life. Rural Japanese women would repair their garments, their bedding, whatever else with whatever fabric you had on hand. Typically that was something that was indigo, so something we would probably think of as being denim or cotton canvas, and stitched with white thread. But there wasn't a process that was specific, like there wasn't a rule about how you had to do it or what patterns there were. You just started layering pieces upon pieces upon pieces because you couldn't go out to the Walmart. That just didn't exist then. This was something you did out of necessity, and it has a really long history. And during World War II, people started to come back to it and really reminisce about what their ancestors and what their families might have done to repair their old garments. Like almost anything else in history, something that starts out as a really basic practical thing becomes more elaborate with time and practice. So there are Sashiko examples that are incredibly intricate. So if you go online now and look at some of the sample kits, you will find these amazing ones with interlocking circles or emblems of cranes or wave patterns, and they're gorgeous. But they really started as something as simple as a patching method. I like to call all of what I'm doing as using the Sashiko stitching to repair. I'm not making true Boro because that actually has its own thing. That's the repair, both the thing that needs repairing and became to be known as the garment that was repaired. What I'm doing is just inspired by it. First off, when we talk about visible mending, what do we mean? When we're doing invisible mending, which I think most people think of when they're trying to do patching, it is something like this. We want to have a patch that doesn't show up very much. It's going to be something kind of invisible. I have patched this with a piece of fabric from behind, a couple, and I've just stitched over it multiple times so it bonds with the fabric. This is invisible mending. Or almost. There are people who do a much better job of it than me. If you ever want to check out Indigo Proof online, her work is exquisite and her thread matching is amazing. You wouldn't even know that there was anything kind of repair that happened. But this, for most people, this is what you use. Then we have visible mending. And this is when you say, here, I've mended it for realsies. And you don't try to hide it. You try to make it part of it. This is based on a really, really super simple Sashiko. Running stitch, back and forth, up and down, Maybe you change the color of thread. I did the patching from behind the fabric underneath the hole, sort of pinned it in place, and then just did this over it. For a more elaborate version of it, this has interlocking circles patterned. So I actually took something like, I think it was a pill bottle that I used and traced around here and just did a series of those lines in pen. I basted the pattern, the patch underneath. Basting just means stitching with a big running stitch and something that may or may not stay. It's just holding the fabric in place. And then I stitched over it. And I used white embroidery thread and off-white. There is a real Sashiko thread that you can get. That's available here at Remainders. If you want to get the true stuff, that's awesome, but you don't have to. The nice thing with all of this is you don't have to be really specific with your tools. This will be fine. You can also use standard embroidery thread. Usually if I'm using standard embroidery thread, it comes in 6 strands. I like to separate the strands so they're a little bit thinner, maybe only 3 strands each, because it's a little easier to sew. If I'm going to do that, I might use something like beeswax or Thread Heaven. Thread Magic is another name. It's just a thread conditioner. So any kind of wax that you put your thread through to help hold the fibers together. If you don't have that kind of thread, that's also okay, because you can use a standard thread and do what I call quadruple threading. For that, I'll take a big long piece, cut it, fold the thread in half, and then thread the needle with the folded in half thread. So you've got something that now is almost the same thickness as your embroidery thread. So you never have to get stuck just because you don't have all the tools. This doesn't have to be that detailed. For this example, I already set up a patch on this pair of pants, this very heavily falling apart pair of pants. And I already did a basting stitch around here. Basting stitch, running stitch, all the same type of idea. Most of it, by the way, is just a matter of how big you're making your stitches. So if I'm doing a real basting stitch, sometimes I will do really big ones, like 1/2 inch long. Running stitch, usually it'll be a little smaller, maybe 1/4 inch. Sashiko typically is also about 1/4 inch. But no one needs to get too hung up on it. So I'm taking my thread, knotting at the end, trimming, and starting from beneath. So you can see I'm showing you this with a patch underneath so you can really see where the holes are. And that way we're kind of featuring the stitching and saying, here, we know there's a hole. If you want to, and the holes are getting kind of funky like this, and you don't want to deal with the extra threads, you can always trim those out. Get them to the side. If you really want to have fun with this, sometimes I've seen people do things like little monster faces and put eyeballs inside of here, especially with knee patches for kids' clothing. That's kind of fun. So, sky's the limit. But the basic idea, you're melding the fabric from behind, the patch fabric, with your stitching. Let's see if I can pull this a little smoother. Yep. In and out. Stab stitch. Sashiko. Stab in, stab out. Stab in, stab out. It's really as simple as that. I'm doing a very, very simple pattern of, this was the shape of my patch. I'm going to just keep echoing that all the way around. You can see that what this does is helps the backing fabric meld to the outer fabric. and it'll just make it a lot more secure. And it's also nice. If you want to, you can go for a slightly more traditional approach, and then you would use something like a white or off-white thread. Or go wild, use multiple different colors of thread. Whole point of this is it's visible. We're not trying to hide it. We're not trying to pretend that this is something other than what it is. There's a Japanese principle called kintsugi, and this is about repairing things. I think traditionally it had been used for pottery. And the idea was that you repair it, but you accent the cracks. You will do things like add a little gold leaf into each crack so that the repair becomes visible. It's a really lovely principle. It's also just a beautiful idea that our cracks and our bumps and the things that have to be repaired are part of us and can be made beautiful. But at any rate, you get the idea. I will patch this all the way around and just keep going. So this class and others like it here at Remainders Creative Reuse are made possible by a generous grant from the City of Pasadena Arts and Culture Commission. Thank you very much, both for joining us and to the City of Pasadena and to you. I hope you'll come back next time.